In addition to the popularity of landscape painting, which emerged in the 19th century, we also see this new interest in what we call genre scenes and also still life painting. And by genre scene, I simply mean a scene of everyday life, something ordinary, nothing historically important, a kind of everyday occurrence. And I think part of the popularity of these genre scenes is that they often reflected on rural life. And if you think about what's happening in the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution that's taking place, the fact that people are leaving behind this agrarian existence that they had known for quite some time and moving to bigger cities and to work in industrial areas, it's no surprise that there's a kind of nostalgia for small town life or a rural existence. And this is just one example. So this is the painter William Sidney Mount, who is interesting in that, unlike so many Americans, he was extremely adverse to studying abroad. So instead, he never left the United States. He took classes at the National Academy of Design. And he was such a nationalist that he also would not use imported pigments in his paintings. In fact, he was from Long Island, New York, and he preferred to experiment with native pigments. So things that he could find locally, sandstone, things that were available easily in the beaches. And oftentimes his work reflects his own experience as a young man growing up on Long Island, but it also creates these scenes that remind us of how society is shifting and changing. So in Bargaining for a Horse, we see two men, the farmer who's whittling away at his stick, who has an empty barn that is essentially in a state of disrepair, and this city slicker, the man who has the top hat, who is trying to make a deal for this horse. So it's the kind of theme that was very popular because it seemed to extol the good life, the rural folk who were untouched by urbanization, something that we were longing for and something that reminded art consumers of their childhood or their youth in a smaller town. William Sidney Mount also created eel spearing at Sawtucket in 1845, and this was a work that was painted for a New York lawyer. His name was George Washington Strong, who also wanted a piece that would reflect his childhood growing up on Long Island. And in fact, in the background, you see his family home, which was called St. George. And it's interesting that this woman, who we might assume is a slave, is holding her spear, although she is actually spearing eel, in much the same way that St. George is depicted in religious art where he slays a dragon. So it's kind of a play on the words, and it references St. George, which is the name of the family home. It's also interesting that we often see African Americans depicted in the work of William Sidney Mount. But essentially there's this kind of nostalgia, a boy on a boat, they're going off, he has this woman who's helping him, but there's this nostalgia for the simpler life, the quieter time in a less urban environment. These are also great examples of genre scenes. And this is Lily Martin Spencer, who was a very popular painter up until about the time of the Civil War. And she is an interesting woman. She comes from a family who supported women's rights. And she is not only a successful artist, but she is a supporter of her unemployed husband and 7 children. She actually gave birth to 13, but 7 children survived. She was essentially self-taught, and she went to New York and sold these works at the Art Union, and then they would make prints, engraved prints of her work, and those would be sold on subscription or to larger audiences, and that got her a lot of wider recognition. She's the kind of artist who was very popular with the public. People liked these scenes. They liked the story, the playfulness of kiss me and you'll kiss the lasses, which refers to the spoon that she's holding, which has molasses on it. But it's also a play on words because a lass is an Old English word for a girl. So if you kiss her, you will taste the molasses or the lasses because she's already tasted it herself. And these women are often very friendly. They engage the audience. They look out at you sort of invitingly. They're these rich interiors with lots of still life surrounding them, fruit, animals, what have you. And shake hands is similar in that this woman, offers you her hand, but yet you can tell that it's covered in flour because she's been working on making this meal. So she's an interesting figure in that she is one of the really successful female artists of the 19th century in the US, but she's also better known because she's a commercial artist. And while she's popular with the public, the critics find her work offensive. In fact, one critic describes these works as grinning housemaids, and they often refer to them as kind of vulgar for this seemingly flirtatious and direct way that these women communicate with the audience. And of course, there's a long history of that. If we look at 17th century paintings, Jan Vermeer, for example, in Holland, created the milkmaid. This idea of women in domestic settings is nothing new. But what was new is that Lily Martin Spencer gives you this kind of sass, this woman who looks out at you and seems confident, and that was viewed as radical by the critics. Edward Hicks is difficult to categorize. We might say that these are genre scenes, but they're also very much religious paintings. He was a Quaker, and he had also been a sign painter. So you can see the evidence of that in the fact that the title of this painting wraps around it. This is a theme that he was very interested in, the idea of the peaceable kingdom, and he did over 60 different versions of it in this very kind of folk art style. The story comes from the Bible. It's in the 11th chapter of Isaiah, and it says, quote, "The wolf shall also dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young man and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them." So it was the idea of kind of opposing creatures, a lion and a lamb. This would be predator and prey, but the idea is that all of these creatures of God's earth would create a kind of harmony and exist peacefully with one another. What's also very interesting about these folk art renderings of the peaceable kingdom is that he localizes them. So in this one on the left, this is an actual natural bridge, which can still be found today in the state of Virginia. And if you look closely at the background here, you might recognize this scene. Yes, you've seen it before. You saw it in Benjamin West's Penn's Treaty with the Indians. It's just that here you're looking at it in reverse. And that's probably because Edward Hicks saw a print of this. A print is almost always the reverse of the painting. In terms of still life, it's typically an art that is associated with women. So Lily Martin Spencer created the still life with berries and currants on the left, and Margaretta Angelica Peale, who was related to Charles Wilson Peale, who we studied earlier, also did these fruit still lifes. Now, there's also a long tradition of that goes back to the 17th century in Holland, where women were also associated with still life paintings. These were meant to be reminders of the fleeting nature of life. Cut flowers are always very short-lived, but there were also usually symbols in these works, like the butterfly, for example, which was a reference to Christianity, to the idea of the three states of existence. So a butterfly is first a caterpillar, then it goes into a cocoon, and then it becomes a butterfly. And that's a kind of metaphor for life, death, and resurrection. These works by American still life painters tend not to be as symbolic, but they're really highly illusionistic, and they're the kinds of things that Americans wanted. This is what sold on the art market. So these were the kinds of things that Americans in the 19th century would hang in their homes and would show their kind of middle class tastes.